I'm Jason Hauk. I'm the station manager of KSKQ Community Radio, and it's really an honor for me to be here celebrating our 13th annual Independent Media Week. Mickey Huff is current professor of social science and history at Diablo Valley College in San Francisco Bay Area, where he co-chairs the history department. He is a lecturer in communications at California State University in East Bay, has taught sociology of media at Sonoma State University, and of course, as I mentioned, the executive producer and co-host of the Project Censored radio show. It's a weekly syndicated public affairs program. It's on KSKQ Thursdays at 9 a.m. And he serves as a critical media literacy consultant for Triworthy.com. I could go on.
You can go on.
Am I done?
You're good. Extra special thanks to Jason Hauk for the invitation and the fantastic introduction. Special thanks to Wes Brain, too. It was great to be on the show the other day. Independent Media Week and Whistleblower Tour, that's going on right now. I'm part of that, and there's another event next week. I'll actually be also tomorrow at the Metaphysical Library at 6 o'clock for a meet and greet if anybody wants to hang out there. Of course, special thanks to KSKQ Community Radio, the United Nations Association of Southern Oregon Jobs with Justice, Rogue Valley Vets for Peace. A big round of applause for the Veterans for Peace all over this country. Our Revolution, Southern Oregon, Citizens for Peace and Justice, Unite Oregon, and supported with a grant from Oregon Humanities Foundation. So thank you all for that, and thank you, Jason, for helping me not be remiss in thanking so many people in this community that do so many great things, and of course also have welcomed me here, and this is not my first time here. I've been coming here off and on for several years doing various talks. Thank you all for coming out on a Thursday night and a bit warm. Thank you too for being patient with technology. The university is, well, the university historically is a great place to discuss important ideas. The university of the 21st century, however, has increasingly been co-opted and controlled by outside private interests with money. And as long as the students are shoveling out money, the university seems to, be okay with that. When it comes time to supporting the community, however, you can't always say the university is the most supportive. And I'm saying that as somebody that's taught at over a dozen places, and over the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen more and more control taken over public universities and moving it away from community and more problematic away from the students. And so the reason I do what I do is because of the students, and because I myself am a lifelong learner, and I'm assuming all of you are too. That's why you're here. So thank you all again for coming. Tonight, you'll see there were several titles for the talk, and thank you to Jason for coming up with those. Resisting the media was one of them, and I wanted to talk about resisting corporate media. And well, that is going to be a recurring theme, and so too we'll be talking about supporting community media, including community radio. But where I'm going to start is I want to start going back to the 1960s and 70s. I also just co-authored a book with a former student, now colleague of mine at Project Censored, Nolan Higdon. And to me, it's really an honor to be able to have, well, I guess it's an honor to have taught for almost 20 years, a privilege actually, but it's so wonderful to see some of the people that I've taught over the years come back and actually be peers and colleagues of mine. And the new book that I just finished with Nolan is called United States of Distraction. United States of Distraction is an interesting title, and that's why I'm going back to the 50s and 60s here right now, is because I want to talk about that. And the subtitle of that is Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It. That book will come out this summer, and I'm hoping to be traveling around again on that, and maybe I'll be back up here. But with that, I wanted to say that some of you may remember FCC Chairperson Nicholas Johnson. Nick Johnson was in the FCC in the 60s and 70s, and when he came out, he wrote a really fascinating book called Your Second Priority. And what Johnson was referring to, in fact, media scholar Robert McChesney wrote a lot about this, and I'm 48, and so my introduction to Johnson actually came through McChesney, right? And so McChesney had a really pointed insight about Johnson regarding why the state of journalism ought to be everyone's concern, noting that corporate news media are, quote, set up to maximize profit for a relative handful of large companies, end quote. McChesney went on to say, the system works well for them, but it's a disaster for the communication needs of a self-governing society. So if we want to change the content and logic of media, we have to change the system. As former Federal Communications Commissioner Nick Johnson likes to put it, whatever your first issue of concern, media had better be your second, because without change in the media, your primary area is far less likely. Progress in your primary area is far less likely. Well, so why the media is all of our concern, and why free press protections are so important for all of us, right? And this is what Nick Johnson is getting at. So there's some other things that are going on in the 60s and 70s that sort of help get us where we are today. Lao Tzu once wrote that if you're not careful, you'll wind up where you're heading. And if you go back into the 50s and 60s, particularly the early 70s and the Nixon years, some of you will recall there was an earnest effort at the enclosure of the commons and sort of a theft of the public sphere by private interests. And it's a very, very significant issue, and it's really at the core of some of our current challenges that we face. James Buchanan, Milton Friedman, Grover Norquist, these characters this is all by design. There's nothing accidental about the anemic state of our political discourse and media offerings today. This is all by design. And so I want to go back a little bit more again in time to sort of talk about what the impact, what this effect has been. And the overall theme here, of course, is not just resisting corporate media, but it's also talking about the significance of critical media literacy education with focus on social justice pedagogy, and why, again, this is all of our business and something that we all really need to participate in, and if it's going to get anywhere. So, just was combing around not long ago, and I happened to be reminded of a Carl Sagan quote that was from a book called Demon Haunted World, Science is a Candle in the Dark, back from 1995. And I'm kind of starting here with 95. As an historian, I'm one of those weird people that hops around, kind of visits this part and that and connects dots. And the next thing you know, we're going to be back in the 1920s, and then we'll come back up here and we'll fly around, and we don't even need a DeLorean to do it. So at least people still get that joke, right? But here's what Sagan had to say in 1995, and it's pretty interesting to me. Quote, I have a foreboding of an America in my children or grandchildren's time when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all the manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of a very few, and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues. When the people have lost the ability to set their own agendas and knowledgeably question those in authority, when, clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, our critical faculties in decline, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what's true, we slide, almost without noticing, back into superstition and darkness. The dumbing down of America is most evident in the slow decay of substantive content in the enormously influential media. The 30-second sound bites now down to 10 seconds or less. Lowest common denominator programming, credulous presentations on pseudoscience and superstition, but especially a kind of celebration of ignorance. And are we there yet? In the 60s, Andy Warhol, thanks, man, I appreciate it. Thanks, Dave. Andy Warhol talked to us about everybody would have 15 minutes of fame. Now we're down to 280 characters on Twitter, right? And so this fleeting attention span is all part of this design. And in fact, this has become such a such an issue and topic of debate in social sciences, humanities, social psychology, etc. There's a whole field of study dedicated to this problem. Has anybody in here heard the field of study called Agna Ecology? Anybody know Agna Ecology? Strange word. Means the study of human ignorance and its impact on civilization. Should be a bustling field, right? Robert Proctor down at Stanford is one of the few people doing it. There's a whole book about it, and I suggest you check it out if you want to see just where we have been heading. From Sagan, I want to keep going back on our little history tour here. Of course, in 1985, going 10 years prior to that, we had Neil Postman, media ecology professor at New York University, and he wrote a fabulous book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. Right, again, are we there yet? So look, this is again by way of saying, and again, if you want a little central thesis here, again, how we got here. We are here by design. We are in the era of fake news, right? In a so-called post-truth America that uses alternative facts to buttress confirmation belief systems, where we have siloed, partisan sort of harangue which substitutes for actual public discourse. And so if we go back and take a look at, say, we just bookmarked Postman, but I want to go back earlier than that because I want to talk about Daniel Boorstin. How many people here remember Daniel J. Boorstin? Fantastic U.S. historian. And as a lot of it's interesting, a lot of historians don't, there are not a lot of public intellectuals that are historians. My good friend Peter Kuznick at American University, along with Oliver Stone, authors of Untold History of the United States, their recent re-edition just came out with a 200-page new chapter. So it's like an extra little book tacked on about the last 7 years. Boorstin, of course, you all knew Howard Zinn, and there are certainly a few historians that were public intellectuals, but I like to see more of us, because I think history provides context for the present that is sorely lacking in a lot of the discourse we see today, even in intellectual settings. Boorstin wrote a fantastic book in 1962, among the many other books he wrote, but this was a rare occasion where a well-known historian was actually writing about what was going on around him in the present. And that book was called The Image, a guide to pseudo-events in America. As you can see by my, I was telling you earlier, by my age, right, I'm one of those people that's caught between various technologies. I have a lot of papers and books, but then computers couldn't get that screen to work, so, oh well. Good thing we do still have this old technology called books. But this was Boorstin's book, The Image, a guide to pseudo-events in America. And what he was really talking about was, how we were turning into, purposely, we were turning into really a vapid and superficial culture. But it wasn't just the corporate interests and the media and the political class that was deviously turning us into this. We were also asking for it collectively and societally. And so I don't like to read a lot of stuff to when I do public talks, but in this case, there's some things that I think I want to read and just kind of skip over some things, because this is in 1962, and I think that more significantly that I'm up here even talking about that, just listening to Boorstin in his own words in that time. He says in this book, he describes a world of our making, how we have used our wealth, our literacy, our technology, and our progress to create a thicket of unreality which stands between us and the facts of life. I recount historical forces which have given us this unprecedented opportunity to deceive ourselves and to befog our experiences. Right? So think about this whole cultural landscape of fake news and alternative facts, right? And the post-truth world, right? I mean, these are all things that we have been hearing in the last several years. But again, I submit continuously, this is nothing new, and this has been a long time in the making. Of course, America, Boorstin says, has provided the landscape and has given us the resources and opportunity for this feat of national self-hypnosis, but each of us individually provides the market and the demand for the illusions which flood our experience. And we want, and we believe these illusions because we suffer from extravagant expectations. We expect too much of our world. Our expectations are extravagant in precise dictionary sense of the word, quote, going beyond the limits of reason or moderation. They are excessive. And he gives several examples about how we pick up the newspaper at breakfast. We expect, we even demand that it bring us momentous events to work and momentous events since the night before. We turn on the car radio as we drive to work and expect news to have occurred since the morning newspaper went to press. Just think about the current, what are the current examples of that on Twitter and Facebook, right? And you're like smacking that button for the dopamine hit, you know, and you're just like, did someone like my thing yet? Or I texted you 10 seconds ago and I says you received my message. Why haven't you gotten back to me? You know, again, instant gratification comes with its costs and consequences. And again, Borston goes on and on about this, and I won't read that segment to you. But he goes on to say, we expect everything and everything. Anything and everything. We expect the contradictory and impossible. We expect compact cars which are spacious, luxurious cars that are economical. We expect to be rich and charitable, powerful and merciful, active and reflective, kind and competitive. We expect to be inspired by mediocre appeals for excellence, to be, I won't make any asides about university-driven pathways and all this other top-down management gimmickry coming out of the corporate, sort of corporate management schools, but you can just imagine what that looks like nowadays. We expect to be inspired by mediocre appeals for excellence, to be made literate by illiterate appeals for literacy. We expect to eat and stay thin, to be constantly on the move and ever more neighborly, to go to church of our choice and yet feel its guiding power over us, to revere God and to be God. Never have people been more the masters of their environment, yet never has a people felt more deceived and disappointed, for never has a people expected so much more than the world could offer. By harboring, nourishing, and ever enlarging our extravagant expectations, we create the demand for the illusions with which we deceive ourselves and which we pay others to make to deceive us. 1962. So, the story of the making of our illusions, the news behind the news, has become the most appealing news of the world, and Project Censored, founded in 1976 by Carl Jensen. The purpose was to discuss the news that doesn't make the news and analyze why. I focus a lot on Borston and illusions because some of you may be familiar with Chris Hedges. Empire of Illusion, Death of a Liberal Class. I mean, without these people that I've just mentioned, Chris Hedges wouldn't have a book career. And don't say that disparagingly. But I mean, you know, Hedges has done a pretty good job of reminding us who a lot of these people are and were. Which is kind of what I'm doing here. Because again, when we look around in the present and we see these challenges and we think these things happening, in the last few years, I mean, again, this is my 10th Project Censored book. I'm doing the 11th. I just finished the United States of Distraction book. I have a Global Critical Media Literacy Educator Resource Guide, which you can find at gcml.org. You can download it for free. It's a 120-page critical media literacy guide with all kind of resources in it, right? So this is what we try to do, the antidote to fake news. We'll get into some of that more in a little bit. The thing with the reason that the reason that I go back in history and I talk about these other people and these ideas is because in the last couple of years, so many people have contacted us at Project Censored and said, "What's going on? What's fake news? What do we need? How is this happening?" And you say, "Well, that's interesting because we've been studying this for a long time. In fact, we've been studying it for so long, it wasn't called fake news. It was just called propaganda." You know, or misinformation or disinformation, right? And so I'm glad that people are now kind of a little more attuned to this, right? And one of the things that we've seen is declining trust in all of our civic institutions, which is not a good thing at all. But during this decline, and again, I'm going to go back to that in a minute because it's been by design. A lot of people have been turning off media and turning off corporate media because they don't know what to trust. Another part of this is because we don't have enough of a vibrant free press that everybody can get their hands on these kinds of sources. I mean, they could if they went online and they looked for it, right? But we live in that great culture of convenience. We go home, we hit the red button, the screen comes on, tells us what's going on. We even have, you know, different versions of it, right? We have the Fox News for conservatives, we have the MSNBC for liberals, we have CNN for whatever sort of is smashed in between some of that. And you know, quite honestly, that's such a myopic right-center sphere that also really shows part of the problem when you zoom out of it with a critical media literacy lens. So I'm going to go back a little further. Of course, we'd be heavily remiss to not mention our friend George Orwell in 1984. And there's some very interesting lessons, not just on surveillance society, but on who controls the present, controls the past, who controls the past, controls the future, right? Today's fake news is tomorrow's fake history, right? So notice how we loop ourselves around. These are very significant things, so we are very grateful to previous people who have tuned us to what we face. And many people were warning us that this was going on. It's just not everybody was always listening. I'm going to go back further than Orwell, and of course our good friend Aldous Huxley, whom Neil Postman thought we ended up a lot more like in Brave New World, loving our servitude through our desires, and we create our own prisons in our own minds. Coupled with Orwell, it makes for a nasty dystopian mixture in the present. But I'm going to go a little bit before even Aldous Huxley to someone that I think who has had more of an influence on our fake news dilemma and 21st century propaganda than any of these other folks were trying to warn us about it. This guy was telling the elites how to do it, and his name was Edward Bernays. So many of you may recall Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, right? Bernays was first tapped, Bernays lived a long life. He lived to be over 100 years old. And he spent a lot of time with his uncle. He spent a lot of time, learning about psychology, learning kind of what made people tick. And Bernays, I think, and again, this is another area where it's like it's easier to just read you a brief passage because it's so completely, well, not only is it spot on in terms of how public relations works and manipulates public opinion, but Bernays went on, of course, to write a book literally called Propaganda in 1928. Right, and if you don't know it, it's a short little book, but if you don't know it, you should really check it out because it definitely, not only does it describe how to control and manipulate populations in a democratic republic, it argues that this is how we ought to be running modern democratic states. And again, later, of course, people like Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky took Bernays to task in the book called Manufacturing Consent, which is one of the terms that came out of the World War I period with Bernays and journalist Walter Lippmann, as well as George Creel from the Creel Commission, who ran the first government propaganda agency, officially called the Committee for Public Information. And the purpose of it was to whip up support for World War I in a largely docile and sort of pacifistic population, didn't want to get involved in the European War. In chapter 1 of that book called literally Propaganda, this is obviously before propaganda became a dirty word, right? 1920, it's a propaganda, right? You're like, oh, yeah, now you see that and you're like, that's supposed to be bad, right? And of course, we like to blame the Soviets and the Nazis, right, for trashing the propaganda as a term and a tactic. What few people seem to recall, however, is it was Eddie Bernays that was one of Goebbels' best teachers. The Nazis based their entire propaganda campaign off of people like Eddie Bernays, and so did the Soviets. And of course, here in the US, we've never veered from Bernays' propaganda. We've just become more and more sophisticated about it, and now we even do it digitally with bots, algorithms, sock puppets. Not only are these people you never see, they're now things you never see, or even heard of, or can technologically understand, right? Here's Bernays in 1928. Chapter 1 of that book is called Organizing Chaos. Very honest man was Eddie Bernays, strange to say, but he was very honest about what he was doing, and he was arrogant enough that he believed he was right, and what he was proposing was just and proper and patriotic, right? We need to remember that these people truly believe that they're doing the right thing. They believe they're doing God's work. I'm now sort of riffing on Providence from Manifest Destiny, right? That kind of business. Organizing Chaos, Chapter 1, quote, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Okay, so can we see where Bernays' ideology is coming from here in sentence 1? The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society, Bernays, constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. And writing in 1928, it was men. for the most part. This is the logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. He said again, whether the attitude one chooses towards this condition, he said, it remains a fact that in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons, a trifling fraction at our 120 million, now 320 million, who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. He's telling you straight up who controls the agenda. And look, the agenda can have sort of a miniaturized, shrunken down right-left paradigm or dynamic, where you can wildly debate in the little myopic circle and say, gee, look, we've heard from the right, we've heard from the left, we've heard from the Republicans, we've heard from the Democrats. Whatever in the world else could there be? Well, as we know, a lot, an awful lot, in fact. But Bernays even went further about the commodification of political culture. He went on to say, in theory, everybody buys the best and cheapest commodities offered on the market. In practice, if everyone went around pricing and chemically tasting before purchasing the dozens of soaps and fabrics or brands of bread which are for sale, economic life would be hopelessly jammed. To avoid such confusion, society consents to have its choice narrowed to ideas and objects brought to its attention through propaganda of all kinds. There is consequently a vast and continuous effort going on to capture our minds in the interest of some policy or commodity or idea. We must find a way to make free competition function with reasonable smoothness. He believes that competition is what makes this all go around. He says to achieve this, society has consented to permit free competition to be organized by leadership and propaganda. Don't take my word for it. Go read him in black and white. He's telling you that, riff on a little Hamilton here without Broadway. Americans are too stupid and ignorant to govern their own affairs, therefore the smart elite people need to help them figure it out. Right? So it's not in Iraq 2002-3, do we go to war in Iraq? It's when will we go to war in Iraq? Or when will the UN basically say we can go to war in Iraq, right? It's a frame. And when it turns out that the weapons of mass destruction are weapons of mass deception, we just kind of turn the page and we move to the next thing. And, again, Bernays warned us about this. Oh, by the way, who sold us that war? Who sold us the Iraq war? John Rendon, the Rendon Group, one of the biggest PR organizations in the United States. Who sold us the first Gulf War? Hill and Knowlton, one of the biggest PR firms in the United States that trained the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, Naira, to lie to Congress about Iraqi Guard throwing babies out of incubators, which never happened, right? I mean, this is age old. And, these people are so, let's put it this way. They're not necessarily clever, but they don't need to be in a lot of ways because they see something that has worked historically, and they're like, well, look, why reinvent the wheel? In World War I, it was Eddie Bernays and the Creel Commission that were talking about the Germans ripping the arms off of Belgian babies. It was them telling you got to fight them over there so you don't have to fight them over here. And we even had a song, over there, right? Well, what do we say when we came in at 9/11? We got to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here. I mean, they just recycle this propaganda and appeals to our emotion. I mean, if anybody was even a modest student of history, this stuff would have red flags all over it. All over it. And you'd see it marching down the square and you'd be like, oh, here comes the nonsense machine. But we don't, collectively as a society. Many of us cower. Many of us say, oh, they're out to get us. Right? Fear and hope are the great levers. And we certainly see them all the time, right? Whether it's hope and change or make America great again or morning in America, right? Fill in the blanks. Right? Or we've got to get the terrorists, we've got to fight the evil doers because they hate our freedom. Look, can you distill it anymore? Can it get any more dumbed down? Can it get any more less specific? Well, again, the more vague we have these kind of political communications, the easier it is to sort of just pull the wool over everyone's eyes because it means something different to everyone hearing it. This is the brilliance of this kind of propaganda. And Bernays said, we need more, not less. And so with Bernays, right, we want to, that's our little sort of, now we'll let's ride up a little bit on what's going on with how are we seeing the Bernays of our own day. Well, I mentioned several of these groups already. And what we see now is we actually have a name for some of this stuff. But it's interesting because fake news, while being propaganda in itself, the whole concept of fake news has now been weaponized. And so it can be used against anything with which someone disagrees. So you come and you say, oh, I have this information about this, well, that's fake news, right? And remember, let's remember that the rise of fake news in its current iteration took place coming out of the 2016 election, the 2016 election cycle, and that's something that we should definitely not forget, because the Democrats were originally wielding that out of the DNC when they were blaming the possibility of Russian interference in the election. And they were saying that, well, Putin is trying to undermine the electorate and send fake messages, and he's working with Trump. I mean, here we are several years later, right? And we're just now seeing a redacted version of this investigation from Mueller. In fact, we're not even seeing it, right, because it is redacted, and it just came out. I obviously didn't have a chance to read through the 381 pages that they released today. But what Mueller said was that, he couldn't prove collusion. But there might be obstruction, so it's not like there's nothing there. It depends on whether Congress will do its job. No, don't answer that. Right? Because Nancy Pelosi says impeachment's off the table and so forth. But it didn't take long before the corporate media began picking up on this fake news moniker. And then, of course, the brilliant showman, the brilliant con man, the brilliant brander of nothing, Donald Trump, right, made a whole career of this. That was just handed to him on a silver platter. Said, you're fake news. These people talking this way, the Washington Post, New York Times, his favorite target, Jim Acosta at CNN, before he was even inaugurated, pointed over the podium at Jim Acosta and said, CNN, you're fake news. I mean, again, these people just gave him this glorious gift that never ends. The confirmation bias defense mechanism. If you don't agree with something, it's not true. I'm right, you're wrong, no matter what. Of course, anybody who's been watching Roger Ailes and Fox News since the mid-90s knows that that was their modus operandi, right? And they just kept moving it around. And of course, you can't out-Fox Fox, but CNN and MSNBC have certainly tried, right? For the last couple years, I don't think Rachel Maddow has, bothered to see anything outside of Russiagate. There's been very little reporting other than what media scholars refer to this as pre-mediation. In media theory, pre-mediation is the ever-present fixation on something in the future that hasn't technically happened yet, that we don't technically know, but we're going to continually spin our wheels in the present and speculate about what we think it means now, even though we technically don't know what it means now because the information isn't available yet. But man, does it rake in the viewers, right? And after Bill Barr, the Attorney General, who was just appointed to help try to cover this up, well, why do we know that? Well, because this is the same Bill Barr that helped cover up Iran-Contra in the 80s. This is the same Bill Barr that was in the CIA in the 70s when George Herbert Walker Bush was there. This is the same Bill Barr that tried to trash the records of the Church Committee so we wouldn't know about COINTELPRO and we wouldn't know about CIA dirty deeds overseas, right? This is the same Bill Barr. Ew, I mean, how many times are you going to trot these ghouls out? And you're just going to sit there like a man of integrity. The Attorney General is there's nothing to see here, people, nothing to see. When somebody like Bill Barr says there's nothing to see, we need to see it, right? We need to see it. And I'm not even suggesting that, when we see it, it'll mean Putin and Trump are buddies and they planned it all along and whatever. I don't even know. I don't know because I haven't seen it yet, right? I'm not going to engage in premediation. We have a right to see every single bit of that information, all of it. We had a right for the Church Committee to keep going, but man, they stopped like 10% in. And Frank Church was told, right, by the powers that be, it's like, this investigation is neat. It's serving an interesting purpose after Watergate, but I think you're done. In other words, you see a little peek behind the curtain and the show's over, right? We got business to do, right? And we did have business to do. And Reagan came in and started doing it again. And that's when we went right back to the secret dirty wars of the CIA and right back to COINTELPRO. We called them different things, of course. But we just went right back to that, Morning in America, right? And in fact, a number of years ago, where are we? A number of years ago. Ah, here we are, a number of years ago. William Casey is who it was. The director of the CIA, 1981, who, when coming out of one of the early meetings with Reagan, he said, quote, "We'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." Are we there yet? CIA disinformation campaigns are fake news on purpose, right? The CIA history goes way back through to the Washington Post, the New York Times. At one point in the 70s when the Church Committee came out, 76, 77, Carl Bernstein wrote an expose in Rolling Stone that talked about, quote, 400 journalists working as assets for the CIA. What we later learned is there were actually thousands over the years. We've seen interns in newsrooms as recently as 10, 15 years ago at CNN, right? And CNN gets caught saying, like, well, we had some interns from the CIA working in the newsroom. Is there a problem with that? Yeah. So this whole enterprise that Bernays kicks off of disinformation is all about control. It's about controlling public opinion, controlling public debate. In authoritarian cultures, they do it with violence. Well, the United States does it with violence too, right? We have a very violent external foreign policy. We also have a pretty violent internal police state, right? I mean, I'm not going to say that it's the magnitude maybe perhaps of some other countries around the world, but it's there and it's real and it's not a relative game where it says like, well, it's not Saudi Arabia, so we're cool. I mean, if that's the bar that low, then we probably should start asking other questions about the direction humanity has been heading. And hey, it's not all gloom and doom. I'm getting to some good things here. But it's important to talk about now what are the more recent manifestations of propaganda. And one of the biggest things that we've seen in the last 10 years is the splash in of social media. Facebook in particular, now Twitter, Instagram. Just like we have 6 companies that do 90% of the media, corporate media here, we've got about a big 5 in the tech sector, whether it's Google, we got Amazon, we have, and they tend to own each other or own stock in each other, much like the corporate media has over the years. And again, I don't know how much you all are familiar with what's been going on with social media control, but Facebook in particular last year began deplatforming hundreds and over 1,000 people and organizations' pages after they sent up the big trial balloon. So some of you may not remember that before the Facebook purge took place, censoring many of these, and again, these were libertarian sites, they were socialist sites, so they were outside of that myopic bubble, right, where Republicans and Democrats, get to play like they're part of the broad political system, but they're actually the myopic right center. And Facebook then started, CNN's coming into this because they worked with Facebook to have some of these sites censored. We'll get to that in a minute. But Facebook sent up this trial balloon before they deplatformed anybody, and they went after Alex Jones at InfoWars. So, easy target. The guy might as well have a bullseye on him, right? And broken clocks are right twice a day, right? So, and I've known about Jones' work for nearly 20 years, and there have been a few stories over the years where he was on to something. Naturally, he eventually spins it into a ditch, and it turns into a disaster, and he poisons the well for anybody that wants to seriously study and discuss it. But they started deplatforming him, and there wasn't a lot of outcry about it. In fact, not only was there not a lot of outcry, there was a lot of celebration. There was a collective applause from Republicans and Democrats alike, that they're just like, yay, the loony guy has now left the building, right? Except right after that, what happened, and again, whether you like Jones or not is immaterial. The guy had a huge following, had monetized, his version of propaganda under the guise of InfoWars, etc. In his court cases of late, whether it's divorce or now the people over at Newtown can sue him, So that's an interesting development, because among the more lunatic things that Jones has said over the years is that nobody died at Sandy Hook and was harassing parents and so forth there. But during some of his trial for his divorce and so on, his own attorney said, look, the guy's been a performance artist for years. The way that it's gotten through social media and platformed on the internet, it allows people to sort of digest it and just sort of say like, yeah, this is what's really going on. See, again, this is part of a mass disinformation campaign, and I don't know that Jones is a provocateur or an entertainer or a garbage, trash, yellow journalist. I don't know. What I do know is that he seems to suck up a lot of air in a room. And when Facebook went after somebody that had a huge following and they saw applause, that was the move. Then it was like, here's a list of 800 other sites. What did you have? That was quick. You might not have, did you have that ready already? Yeah. I mean, this has been a design, right? This has been a plan again, right? And now, again, this is the behest of Congress. This is the behest of Congress with telecom lobbies saying, like, look, we got to clean up the fake news problem from the last election. So before, you remember, they bring the tech people in, the Zuckerbergs, the others, they dog and pony show them in front of the Congress. People in Congress don't even know, what Facebook is, half of them, right? They don't necessarily even know the tech questions to ask these people. And Zuckerberg's like, well, Facebook's my toy, it's my business, it's my creation, and I take credit for it, and I'm going to go clean this up for you guys because I don't want to be regulated. He has since now trying to change his mind on that, but this is going back into 2 years. And so he said, well, we'll get on that. And so what did Facebook do? What has Twitter done? They started deplatforming people. Notice who they're deplatforming. It's not just Alex Jones, right? They tried to deplatform people like Dave Lindorf or Counterpunch, right? They've deplatformed Antimedia. They've gone after Mint Press News. Congress itself went after Abby Martin in the Empire long after she was even gone from RT and quit of her own accord. Right? They were writing about, she wrote the intro to our new book, Fighting the Fake News Invasion, and she recounts her story of how the Senate Intelligence Committee names her by name for being partially responsible for Clinton's loss that she won for a show that had been off the air for 3 years. And so, we knew Russia was coming back, right? The specter of Russia was coming back. So under the guise of fighting fake news, but it's only Russia that does fake news in the United States, right? It's not the rest of these other, or marginalized ones. If it's far libertarian or far left, right or left, right, that gets pushed out to the sides. But the major corporate media that actively engage in false reporting or misleading reporting, that's called, quote, mainstream media, right? And we don't really get to then question that moniker that they've made for themselves. There's nothing mainstream about 6 corporations that control 90% of this, right? We're the mainstream, us. But under the guise then of fighting fake news, Zuckerberg then is going after these Russian-backed sites. So this is where CNN comes in. CNN, and this was a story broken by Kevin Gostola of Shadowproof, who works with Rania Khalek. And Khalek is overseas now, and she has a few programs on what's called Mafic Media. And Mafic Media on their site, one of their funders is Russia, right? Is the Russian government. By the way, if you wanted to start and go and look and see how many media outlets that the United States government sinks money into, or the BBC sinks money into, or others, right? It's a thing. This is all countries are involved in this. And in fact, Mafic they weren't even hiding it. But CNN went after it because they saw Khalek, and Khalek had a connection with RT, Russia Today. And so they tried to say that well, hey, what's she reporting? Anybody here know Rania Khalek and her reporting? Anybody? Okay, so recently one of the things that she's been doing and reporting about was Venezuela, right? Interesting how that at the same time the United States government is crowing about how Russia is interfering in our elections, we're having a slow motion coup d'etat in Venezuela. The second try this century so far, the second formal official one that we know of, right? Pretty amazing. But Khalek is calling out the propaganda that's spewing from the Washington Post, Republican and Democratic parties, the New York Times, CNN, across the spectrum. This isn't to say that Maduro is the perfect leader. This isn't to say that there aren't problems in Venezuelan politics, but they're Venezuelan politics. They don't need our input on what they're supposed to be doing, right? And yet, here we see Trump and here we see this administration saying, well, this guy's a dictator, he's an authoritarian. Man, if you're using that word for Maduro, what would you talk about? How do you talk about the Saudi royals? I mean, how do you talk about what goes on, in, fill in the blank, right? And other third world dictatorships, that Trump has no problem hanging out with, right? Or Brazil, right? Bolsonaro, etc. I mean, I wonder what the terms they say for these people. Maduro, whether you like him or not, is not a dictator. He was elected by the Venezuelan people. Max Blumenthal, another journalist, actually went to Venezuela to several of the major cities and into several of the major neighborhoods and checked out all the grocery stores and markets and interviewed a lot of people, because one of the big claims was that Maduro was stopping foreign aid from coming in and the people of Venezuela were starving. Well, look, some people in Venezuela, like every other country in the world, including this one, are starving, right? It is a problem. But under the guise of sort of saying, under the regime change banner, the New York Times is crowing about how all this is happening. So Blumenthal went down there. People like Agna Ecology are reporting about this stuff, saying like the New York Times is lying. They're only telling you part of the story, and then they're exaggerating about the rest. CNN was one of my favorites. CNN was, we're covering what's happening. We're covering the great protests. Look at the protests against Maduro. Meanwhile, they'd have tons and tons of other activist work going on of hundreds of thousands of people on the streets that supported Maduro. Right, but they never talked about that. They only talked about the anti-Maduro protests. And CNN even admitted, they said, we're embedded with the Maduro or the anti-Maduro protesters. Okay, at least you're admitting your bias now, right? But no, at CNN, they thought it gave them more credibility. We're embedded with the anti-Maduro protesters, and they're showing just how corrupt this regime is. It's like, more news at 11. It's pretty amazing that this happened. CNN even had, New York Times even had to retract a couple of their stories. That's how bad this was, is that it was such rank propaganda that they were called out on it, that they had to say that, no, okay, well, maybe we were exaggerating that story. Maybe that wasn't exactly what was going on. Well, I mean, why in the hell should we be trusting the New York Times on matters of regime change? You remember Judy Miller? Weapons of mass destruction? Ahmed Chalabi, the guy who was convicted of extortion and had to escape Jordan in the trunk of a car that was a CIA asset, getting hundreds of thousands of taxpayer money, feeding Judy Miller at the New York Times the line of the weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist because he was one of the people on the top 5 list to take over Iraq after we potentially toppled Hussein. Yeah, that story. Judy Miller, New York Times. It's pretty, again, I could go on all day about this nonsense, but I won't. Because I also want to hear from you, and I have a couple other things that I want to talk about that are things that we can do about all of this and what you can do, and I want you after this to tell me some of the things maybe that you're doing to help solve this fake news sort of manufactured crisis. And part of our role in that at Project Censored, at fighting the fake news invasion, is going out and factually vetting some of the best independent alternative journalists that we have, not only in this country, but around the world, that do shine lights in dark places and help us understand what's happening. As George Seldes in the 20th century said, the great George Seldes said, journalism's job isn't to be objective, right, with false equivalencies, and here's an expert on the climate crisis, and here's an expert a climate scientist, and here's 90-some% of them saying that we're in big trouble. Over here is a paid shill from ExxonMobil that works at the Heartland Institute saying, I don't know if that's true. Let's give them equal time for a decade. Seldes said journalism's job is to tell the people what's really going on. And that's what these journalists that we highlight and honor every year do. So, again, we could go on and on about more of this. One more thing I do want to put on your radar, if you're not familiar with it, watch out, because now, under the guise of fighting fake news, a lot of these big tech platforms, they've wizened to this, right? And they're seeing now that it's like, well, the same problem that many of them are helping to create. Well, it's kind of like the medical profession and big pharma, right? If you're not sick yet, they'll help you. You'll help you get there, right? And then they'll help treat and mask the symptoms. Well, here we have the same problem with the Trojan horse tech companies. Under the guise of fighting fake news, they're now offering censorship as a solution. Back to Bernays. We'll tell you what the news sources are that you can trust. And then you can vibrantly argue inside that little myopic circle. But NewsGuard, anybody here know NewsGuard? Well, they're embedding themselves in a lot of browsers. They're working with Google, Facebook, They're going to have a little shield on your web. If you download the NewsGuard browser, you can look at it, and it'll have a green shield because green means good and go, right? Then they'll have a yellow one. Not sure about this source. And then, of course, you know what's next. Communist red. The red shield is evil, propaganda, and fake news. So some of the sites that are on their way to getting the red shield are Counterpunch and Mint Press News and, the old muckrakers and new muckrakers that are calling out the influence of capitalism on all of our institutions. Did I say capitalism? Yeah, it did take me a while to get around to saying it. But that's, of course, what's at the heart or behind most all of these designs for maximization of profits. And I bring that up because I don't know if you saw the interview with the lead editor of the New York Times last year. In an interview was talking about how the New York Times was proud that they didn't have a bias, that they were an objective source. We can laugh. We'll laugh our way through that momentarily. What they said in the next paragraph was that they were a decidedly pro-capitalist newspaper. And I'm like going back. I'm just getting out the dictionary. And I'm just like, so you're an objective source. You're an unbiased source. We're pro-capitalist. We're a pro-capitalist newspaper. Well, thanks. Thanks for admitting that. In case we missed it somewhere. But it's fascinating that this is part of the problem. These people do not necessarily see themselves as biased at all because they're all swimming in the same sea and they're all swimming in the same direction. So anything that seems to be going another direction is obviously wrong and biased because they're set objectively true north. And that's, again, back to Bernays. That's part of how when you control the frame itself, those who control the frame can frame themselves out of it into invisibility. And those are the people who are pulling the wires of the public mind. And we need to see more exposés, more call-outs, and more attention being paid to these people and their agendas. And my very good friend and professional mentor, Dr. Peter Phillips, previous director of Project Censored, tells you who those 300 and some odd people are in his new book, Giants, the Global Power Elite. He names the names, names all the top funding places, hedge funds, where they put their money, that they're running out of places to put their money. We even have a letter signed by 90 people, 90 scholars and activists in the back of the book to them, saying, you can't take it with you. I know you and Elon Musk are trying to go to Mars, because you made a mess of things here, didn't you? And you conned us into helping you for a lot of it, so we could get scraps while the earth burns, literally. Literally. Dar Jamal's new book, it's not a happy read, The End of Ice, but you gotta read it. I know I'm talking to people who already probably read it. This is, again, part of the thing we do, right? This is our practice chorus time, right? Singing to the choir, preaching to the choir. But the thing is that if we can that's why I did this. This is the United States of Distraction book. This is just a galley proof. But this book is written for people that are in their mid-late teens, early 20s. I mean, it's for any age of people that maybe don't know some of the things that I've been talking about here today. But this is something you can hand over to somebody and say, look, check this out. I know it's a book, and people are going to be like, does it have a screen on it? A button? Do you have a version of it where you read to me? Does it have pictures? Yeah. I get that part of our culture. And that part of our culture can also be pretty exciting too. I mean, the visual culture. I'm not demeaning the other means of communication that we have, but long-form thought and argument, that seems to be a dying art. I'm not sure we've ever been great at it. But we have become an increasingly illiterate society in terms of civics, media and free press issues. Again, that's why I started all this with Sagan. And then we went back from there, all right? And Nick Johnson, right? This is all of our business. This is all of our challenge to overcome. The problem is that we have been turned into passive spectators, Daniel Borston, because we kind of liked it a little bit. Some of us worked out in our lifestyle. Work all day, work hard, come home, I got to reward myself with a little junk food news, right? Or a little infotainment. And again, we all have our guilty pleasures. But if we really don't focus on the significance of local journalism and investigative journalism that has been completely gutted since the Fairness Doctrine died in 1987 and since Clinton's 1996 Telecom Act further paved the way for deregulation, so now we're down to a handful of companies. Remember Ben Bigdickian, I forgot to mention him in 1982, former dean of UC Berkeley, journalism graduate school, wrote Media Monopoly 7 editions later. He was the canary in the coal mine in 1982 saying, man, we've only got 50 companies running the media, we're doomed. I mean, Bigdickian died a few years ago, right? We dedicated a book to him, but my goodness. Something that he probably wished he was wrong about, for sure. And again, this is why I go back and forth, is that we have been on this path for a long time. And now that we have this whole fake news, fake debate going on, it's preventing people from really, again, peering behind the curtain to see what it means. Again, like the Washington Post that was crowing about fake news of Trump in 2016 in December, right after the election, right after they reported that the Russians allegedly hacked the Vermont power station. Never happened, never happened, never happened. Took them a couple days to admit it never happened, and they actually got called out by that beacon of investigative leftist journalism, Forbes magazine, who even called them out on their own crap reporting, right? But they handed it to Trump on a silver platter, and he goes, see that? Fake news, right? And Margaret Sullivan, who was there at the time as one of the media writers, was like, I think it's time to retire the term fake news. And I just said, why don't we just retire the practice? Why don't we start there, and then the term will follow? But again, these are the things, these are the challenges we face, and now it's led us back to a very dangerous trend that we've seen in our history, where the press is the enemy of the people, right? And in fact, if we go back in our history with this kind of rhetoric, the Lügenpresse, back to World War I and II, the lying press, right? And the German government used that against any critical media, any critical journalism of the day. Hitler used it to round up journalists and silence voices and shut things down. Here we now see Trump saying that we should be able to shut down a comedy show on a corporate news network, one that used to be owned by the major military industrial complex giant GE. Right? Saturday Night Live is even too poignant for the Trump administration. I would say a mediocre comedy show at best these days. But the war on the press is real, and you remember back in the 70s, so yeah, I'm coming back and forth, because I mentioned James Buchanan, I mentioned Grover Norquist, who wanted to shrink government down to the size we can drown it in a bathtub. Are we there yet? What we're seeing right now, and Noam Chomsky talks about this too, and it's interesting that Chomsky was hitting on this, because we were talking about this in the book, United States of Distraction, and he said it's almost as if, again, that this is being done on purpose. Trump is over here with Twitter. He's distracting you here. He's distracting you there. And meanwhile, the Paul Ryans, the Mitch McConnells, right? They're just mowing down the New Deal, mowing down the Great Society. Betsy DeVos has got a controlled demolition of the Department of Education going on before our very eyes. This is what these people have been dreaming about for decades, and they're doing it, and we're letting them while we fight about fake news. This is by design. Nixon, well, not Nixon, Agnew, Spiro, not even Agnew, someone far more clever than them. William Safire, the speechwriter, right? Remember him? Safire, who writing through the mouth of Agnew, which had to have been a treat, referred to the press as, quote, nattering nabobs of negativism who formed their own 4-H club, the hopeless, hysterical hypochondriacs of history. Right? Well, this is coming right out. Enemy of the people. Right? You see some of these folks that are now around orchestrating this controlled demolition and cover-up, they're coming right out of the Nixon years. They just recycled These are the same people, not their offspring, right? The same people have been pulling the wires that control the public mind and working on these slow motion deconstructive policies. And this, again, is not by accident. And the enemy of the people, right? This is not to be mistaken with media criticism. We're a media criticism organization. We believe media of all sorts should be criticized. We like to be criticized constructively so that we learn. How do you make a better press? How do you make better journalism better? How do you make education better? Well, you don't just take Bill Gates' money and let them decide. And ditto in journalism. You don't just go and watch the top. Well, maybe if we ask CNN, they'll do a better job. You know, as Ralph Nader often says, right? Nader, in one of the many things he's done with us over the years, one of the things he wrote about us is that, you know, if every newsroom in this country had a copy of Project Censored's annual book sitting around, there'd be no slow news days. Right? 24/7, you don't have to fill it up with garbage. You could just go right through here. And our students research these stories, and they vet these stories, and we work on these. So we teach them while we're doing it how to do it, how to be a critical thinker, telling people how to think, teaching them how to think, not telling them what to think, but giving them the tools. And what are the tools? Right? The tools are critical media literacy, education, and critical thinking with a social justice pedagogy that works on helping raise the bar for all of us. And these are the things that we try to teach. So, wrapping here so we can get into some more conversation with you all, out of this war on the press, we should be demanding that not only that we stop this kind of seriously hostile authoritarian rhetoric, but again, more importantly, we stop the practice of demonizing the press. And actually, we took some guff for this at Project Censored because when Jim Acosta at CNN lost his press credentials, Andy Lee Roth and I wrote in defense of the press. And again, people are saying, how could you defend Jim Acosta? And I'm saying, you're totally missing the point in your hyper-partisan silo. If they can do this there, then it paves the way to do it anywhere. So, no, I don't know Jim Acosta personally. I don't know what maybe goes on in his mind. I know what goes on with corporate media and the propaganda model. That I know. Ownership, advertising, elite sourcing. Chuck Todd over at Meet the Press even bemoaned aloud that he said, you know, if I ask my guests the tough questions, they won't come on my show anymore. He said it out loud in an interview. Right? And you're just like, well, dude, did you ever read Chomsky and Herman? Like, did you study the propaganda model ever in school when you were kind of becoming this millionaire journalist? You know, you got to start to wonder. Anytime somebody is a millionaire as a journalist, you got to start asking what in the hell they're doing. Because I bet you they're not doing muckraking investigative journalism. Because the pool of money at the top is not really shelling out for a lot of that. Now, granted, I'm not saying that the Times and the Post and even the cable networks don't ever do any good reporting. They certainly do some decent reporting on various topics. But they just as consistently produce propaganda, mis and disinformation, conceal their biases, all the while calling out biases elsewhere. The CNN Maffick media story was the doozy I started telling you when they were going after Agna Ecology and found out that Russia partially funded them, claimed that they lied about it. The Maffick video people that Gostola wrote about said, no, we didn't lie. We actually told you about it and pointed it to you on the website. And then CNN started the story and they made it into their own story. So they basically manufactured a story about a crisis that they created. And then they went to Facebook and said, do you know that you're platforming sites with Russian funds? And over at Facebook, where they had that ever-sensitive kind of moment, we're saying, oh yeah, we're trying to put the kibosh on the Russian propaganda on Facebook. Yeah, but they're not worried about any of the other propaganda, apparently. Only propaganda comes from Russia. Only Russia meddles with elections. Yeah, ask Boris Yeltsin about that one. So again, where Clinton was meddling in theirs. So the thing with Maffick then is that Facebook, at the behest of CNN, took down all their sites. Took down all their pages. 10 days later, with mass protests, Facebook put it back up. They put the pages back up. But notice what's happening here. You can have major corporate media going to the big tech sector say like, hey, you watching this? We need to flag state-funded media. Like, okay, let's flag it then. Let's start with NPR. Let's start with PBS, BBC. I mean, are you going to flag all of it? You know, even the folks at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, picked up on this right away, right? And they're just like, well, which one are you? So which state media should we be allowed to see and not see? And then they listed a whole bunch of U.S.-backed media programs that are nothing but pro-NATO propaganda. Oh, did I say pro-NATO? One of the Facebook fact checkers for fake news is the Atlantic Council, which is the PR wing of NATO. Again, I mean, you can't even make this up. Which is why the next book we're doing, Censored 2020, is called Through the Looking Glass. And Alice will be invited. Right? Because that's where we're really going here. But in terms of, the pills that Alice may try, the pill that we try is simply called critical media literacy. This is why we have to resist censorship, resist bots, algorithms, Trojan horses, even legislation. We see now there's dozens of states that are now either passing or considering media literacy bills. Media literacy bills. Oh, good. No. They're not critical media literacy bills. They're media literacy that the big tech sector is sucking up with groups like NewsGuard. NewsGuard claims to be a media literacy tool, but they're clearly not. Right? They're trying to winnow and they're trying to buttress their own establishment status quo propaganda, pretending that they are fighting against fake news. So we just did a show on this, and there's an article on the Project Censored site we just did a month ago. Said, has media literacy been hijacked? And the answer is yes, it already has. And so these companies know where to go. They have the money to do it. And they're banking and betting, and they're already ahead of us, but they're betting that not enough of us are going to notice. And I disagree. And that's why that I am writing. I've done three. This will be my third. I think I did 3 books in the last 12 months. We're doing a documentary with Abby Martin of Empire Files on history, and a documentary on fake news. Nolan Higdon and the rest of us at Project Censored, Andy Roth. We're doing as much as we can with our little tiny 5-figure budget organization. But we need all of your help. And you're all already doing so many things yourself. So what I ask people to do is like, well, can you help us? Meaning, helping us is just like, what are you doing and how can we help you? How can I have you on our radio show? It's on at 50 stations. How can I get our films to you? How can I give our books to you? How can I give you our curriculum for free to give to your friends or teachers or wherever? That's what we're here for. We're here to help each other. It's a community effort. We can't do it alone. Especially we need numbers because we don't have dollars. Right? We've got smarts. We've got know-how. We've got grit. We've got gumption. We've got spines. We've got vision. We've got all that. And probably most importantly, what we have that the big moneyed interests don't is we have love. Love for humanity, love for each other, love for the earth. That's something that's sorely missing in our media and in our culture and in our education is empathy and understanding others. And so that's really what we try to do when we're teaching critical media literacy, is we try to remind people that this is about better understanding yourself, better understanding the world around you, and better understanding that person sitting across from you that you think is talking some total foreign language that you never heard because you can't understand why they're wearing a MAGA hat. Well, that critical thinking and critical speaking requires critical listening. And critical listening requires, difficult as it may be sometimes, compassionate listening. Where are these people getting their ideas? Where are they getting their information? What shaped and molded them as young people to make them glom on to us-them mentalities? My way or the highway. You look different, you're bad. There's a new book out by Everhart is her name. Jennifer Eberhardt, called Biased. She's a Stanford social psychologist. If you're not familiar with it, I'd check it out because it really takes a deep dive into who we are and how we can be our own best enemies as well as our own best friends. And again, I riffed on that a little with Borston and a few of the others. We have a responsibility in all of this. And very quickly on the way out, before I hear from you, here's some basic things that we try to impart. We subscribe to the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, number 1, right? That's something that we do and we believe is very important. Seek truth, 4 simple things. Seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable and transparent. Is it that hard, Chuck Todd? Is it that hard? Sean, Rachel. Well, yeah, because these people have decided that they're no longer journalists working in the public interest. Or maybe they never were, some of them. But starting with the Code of Ethics is great. At Project Censored, Andy Lee Roth has 5 ways to flex your media literacy muscles. And this stuff's all online at projectcensored.org. Cut junk food news from your media diet. Turn off the Kardashians. Turn off corporate media garbage. Turn off sensational coverage of sports and what have you. You know, all this business with sex trafficking and I mean, there's 4 million sex slaves just in the United States. Probably never even hear about that. Which is basically how many African-American slaves there were in 1860, right? We see all kinds of attention on Robert Kraft, right, the corporate CEO that owns the New England Patriots, right? And what's this mean for him? And what's this? Meanwhile, he's hogging all this garbage attention, and nobody's bothering to go and find out, like, by the way, how did all these people get here, and why? What's this sex trafficking ring going? What's going on with this stuff? Right? We're all looking at we always look at this other thing to distract us. Cut junk food news from your diet. Follow the money. Always follow the money. I mean, it may not be the reason that something's happening, but wouldn't you like to have the opportunity to decide for yourself? Cui bono? Who benefits out of these relationships? Well, usually not the public. Ask who is treated as newsworthy, riffing again on Chomsky and Herman. We don't see normal, regular, everyday people on the news. It's newsmakers. It's the elite sources, right? And when the corporate media or even the BBC want to report about what's going on in Palestine, they do it from the posh hotels across the way in Israel. They don't go into Palestine to see that stuff. They're like, well, there's some terrorists over there from what we can tell. At least that's all we saw from the bar. Resist news inflation. This is something Carl Jensen, the founder of Project Censored, talked about. We have access to more news than ever before, but it seems to be worth less and less because it repeats and speculates, and then it speculates on its speculation, and then it gets off, and next thing you know, we're talking, you start to get like 8 layers deep into the onion. And I don't mean the onion, the satire paper. I mean how the corporate media has transformed itself into the onion. Where like you look at some of these headlines and you're just like, is this satire is dead? This is, again, where we are. And then the last is seek out and support solutions journalism and what we would call constructive media literacy. A new paradigm for reporting, telling new stories, and not repeating the failures of the past by rehashing them, understanding them, but also being willing to let them go and move on from them. And listen to young people who might have new and bright ideas that we never thought of because we get too locked in our thinking and our behavior and our habits. And the older we get, right, which is great, every day is a good one, but the older we get, the more set we get, and we need to be reminded. And young people are here for exactly that purpose. And I think we owe it to them to be listening more, right? The corporate media, the political parties have no problem finger wagging at the millennials. Right? Hillary, the millennials helped cost us the election. The millennials are apathetic. The millennials don't care. I don't know where they're hanging out, but all the millennials that I have the honor of teaching and knowing, they're changing the world right before our very eyes. Who's at the front of the climate crisis? Some teenage young woman in Europe that went and talked to the people at Davos and others and saying, like, we're not waiting for you. You have all the money in the world. Go feather your nests. I'm going to try to make the world a place that's going to be here for me in 10 years. Well, again, this is exactly what Peter Phillips is calling on these people to do in Giants. Is saying like, hey, you've got kids too, man. And a lot of you live in the coastal areas that are going to be destroyed. What are you going to do? You're running out of places to sink all your trillions of dollars. Build new infrastructure. change our energy systems. It can happen. It's happened before. It could happen again. But we really have to ask, demand, and create those opportunities. We also have a process of establishing an information integrity checklist from Dr. Susan Merritt, a librarian, teaches at San Jose State. It's on our gcml.org site. In fact, the show that we recently did 2 weeks ago with Nolan Higdon on Has Media Literacy Been Hijacked, if you go to projectcensored.org to the radio page, at the bottom of the radio show, we have all these links to all these pages so that you can go in and see what we're trying to do, and you can use this information, right? It is out there. Last but surely not least, remember the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, post-World War II? It's a core of something that Peter Phillips does in all of his classes and something that I mention in all of mine, especially Article 19, something that we should never forget. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. That is a fundamental right that we as human beings have, and it has been recognized. We need to get busy fighting for it across the spectrum. I now leave you back in 1995 with a quote from the founder of Project Censored that I think is apt as ever, and it ends us, I do believe, on the note that we all have work cut out for us, but it's work that needs to be done, it's worth doing, and Carl thought so over 20 years ago. He said, quote, "Since we will all benefit from a more responsible media, we all really should help bring it about. To do this, the corporate media owners should start to earn their unique First Amendment privileges. Editors should rethink their news judgment. Journalists should persevere in going after the hard stories. Journalism professors should emphasize ethics and critical analysis and turn out more muckrakers and fewer buckrakers. The judicial system should defend the freedom of the press provision of the First Amendment with far more vigor, and the public should show the media it is more concerned with the high crimes and misdemeanors of its political and corporate leaders than it is with the crimes and gossip of celebrities." Carl ended by saying, "The effort will be well worth it." And it's an honor to, Carl passed away a few years ago. Peter has passed the baton on to me and several others, and I have to say that I firmly believe that the effort is well worth it, and I appreciate all of you for being here today to hear about this, and I hope we can work on it together. Thank you very much. And now for the time that I've been waiting for, and I'm sure you've been waiting for too. Brevity is not one of my strong points. Apologies for that. But it's hard to cram all of this stuff into one. And I've increasingly tried to accept that challenge because I think connecting all of these dots is important. And I think it gives people different places to jump off of or dive into, right, across the spectrum of our interests, thinking about Nick Johnson, right? So questions, comments, anything at all? I'm more than happy to hear from any and all of you. Yeah?
What about WikiLeaks?
I'm glad you brought it up because I was going to be talking, at least mention what's going on with Julian Assange. WikiLeaks, we've long, in fact, the last 2 books ago, Andy Roth and I dedicated the book to Chelsea Manning. As being a whistleblower. In our 2014 book, one of the main themes of the whole book, in fact, it's here somewhere, the main themes was dedicated to whistleblowers and the notion of free speech, and the title was Fearless Speech in Fateful Times. And it goes back to Foucault's lectures at Berkeley in the 80s, going all the way back to ancient Greece, talking about what it meant to have free speech, and it meant to be fearless. It meant to be able to say whatever it is that's going on demonstrably with evidence, and we deal with it. We deal with it. Well, Assange has certainly been a lightning rod in that regard, as many others have. But Assange has now, well, what was it? I think for the low price of $4.2 billion, the IMF, the United States, and NATO countries helped rig a loan to Ecuador. And mysteriously, around the same time, he was booted out of the embassy. So there's a story there for sure. Whether or not he's extradited, we'll see. I know a lot of people get into the political personality issues with Assange, and I have had some disagreements with some of the things perhaps that Assange has said or done over the years. Doesn't matter, because that's not the point. The point is that Manning got thrown back in prison. Now they're trying to go after Assange. They threw CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou in prison for outing torture because he didn't want to do it. Manning got outed because she was calling out murder and war crimes, not participating in it. You see, it's the message, shoot the messenger here, right? They've been aiming for Assange for years. In fact, the number 2 guy at the CIA a number of years ago, live on CNN, called for his assassination. Hillary Clinton, it was no secret that Hillary Clinton wanted to see him gone, right? Now, we still don't know. According to Assange and his associates, he never met with Trump and Trump's people, despite the fact that Mueller suggests otherwise. That's why we need to see it, and we need to see the evidence, right? As much as people want to complain about WikiLeaks weaponizing leaked information, we could say similar things about Greenwald, Omidyar, the big tech money behind The Intercept, right? But Greenwald has been really good on a lot of things with whistleblowing, but now they've shut down the Snowden files, even though they haven't released 90-odd% of them. So what's going on there? What is going on there? It's almost like another church committee moment, where it's like, well, you got to see that they're spying on you, and now we're going to close down the files. Well, that's back to Foucault and Bentham. That's the panopticon. Now you know they're watching. Will you attenuate your behavior? Will you forget about it because surveillance capitalism is the next big thing? Great book by a scholar named Zuboff, by the way, if you don't know it, on surveillance capitalism. Just came out. But this is very, very real war of information. And in fact, Renee DiResta, she's an MIT scholar as well as someone that works with a company called New Knowledge. Can't get more Orwellian than that. New Knowledge is one of several firms that provides intelligence to the Senate Intelligence Committee about Russia. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that there is an information war afoot, and DiResta crows about it. And she said, there's no neutrality in the information war. You're either on our side or you're with the Russians. And this is about how binary and simplistic she made it, no joke. And they are providing this information to the Senate Intel Committee, and then the material that the Senate Intel Committee published, the Washington Post and the New York Times, didn't really bother to go into a lot of detail until umpteen paragraphs down, that even the New Knowledge people said that, they have no evidence to prove that Russia manipulated the outcome of the election. They did try some, modestly. Nothing even close to what the U.S. has done to other countries, but they did try. And we can't let them do that, right? And so that's where all the focus went. But interestingly enough, the CEO of New Knowledge, I mean, remember all this stuff about why we're going after Assange for leaking things that have never been disproven, right? The CEO, his name's Jonathan Morgan of New Knowledge, got caught meddling in the special Alabama Senate election with Roy Moore, the Republican, the judge, and he said it was an experiment. What they did is they used social media platforms with bots and algorithms to create news stories like fake news or manipulative stories and target people like Cambridge Analytica did. We wrote about that before it came out as well, to make it look like Russia was interfering in the election. I'm not kidding. That was the purpose of the experiment, to see if he could use this, make it look like Russian bots were doing this, and if it would impact the outcome of the election. And the Democrat who won the election said, I didn't know anything about that, and when I'm elected, I'm going to start up a committee and we're going to investigate you. Well, I'm waiting. Yeah, we're waiting. And the guy who's the CEO over at LinkedIn was a big money backer behind New Knowledge. Now, the CEO of New Knowledge did this on his own, not as part of the company, but it's still him. Right? And by the way, how does this tie into WikiLeaks, you ask? Vault 7, one of the wiki dumps, had CIA cables that talked about how the CIA knows how to create bots and algorithms to manipulate elections and make it look like it comes from any country in the world. You know, maybe like Russia. And here New Knowledge specializes in Russia. So again, this is why we're doubling down on the shooting of the messengers, right? is because there are forces at work. Of course there are forces in Russia that might be trying to meddle with the election, and China, and Japan. Fill in the blank. Like I said, they're all doing it. This isn't news to historians and people that are aware of the topic. But it's the degree and the magnitude and the brazenness with which is happening. This is why there's more shooting the messenger. They cannot stomach leaks. They cannot. And they learned that from Ellsberg, who's still around championing whistleblowers, right? They learned that. And so gradually, and by the way, back in the 70s, you could go. Where could you go? You could go to the New York Times. Nixon even tried to shut them down and lost in the Supreme Court. I shudder to think what would happen today. Well, I know what would happen. What would happen today is that none of the major news companies would take Chelsea Manning's leaks, and that's why she had to go to WikiLeaks in the first place. Ditto, yeah. So yeah, let's hear it for that, for WikiLeaks. Because without it, we wouldn't know these things. And this is what the established order wants most, to keep us afraid and to keep us in the dark. And this is why we need leakers and whistleblowers more than ever, because our media system has been winnowing and is ever more a mouthpiece of the transnational capitalist class. It doesn't matter if you're in the United States or in Russia. If you're an oligarch, you're an oligarch, you're an oligarch. And what we have going on right now is almost a war of oligarchs and corporations. And they all want a piece of you to be on their side, but they also need you to be a dutiful consumer, right, and slave labor. So this is, again, why we should be grateful for people like Assange, and people should put aside whatever their differences are and things. And I know that there are people that are also leakers and tech people like Barrett Brown that have serious criticism of Assange, and Edward Snowden has had criticism of Assange. But even Snowden came out and said we should be trying to support Assange, warts and all. And I'm not saying warts and all from me or from my perspective. I'm saying, but even these people, Glenn Greenwald and Snowden, who have taken issue with Assange on occasion, even came out and said, look, this is too important to be splitting hairs. This is the battleground for information now. And if we don't get in on this, like Renee DiResta said, it's not between us and Russia. Right? It's between this elite class of people that Bernays say are behind the curtains that pull the wires of the public mind and all the rest of us on the planet. So I think we outnumber them, but again, we have to be more vigilant in how we demand the protections of these people.
And one is, I gotta just state the obvious, here we are at a college campus, having a pretty important conversation, and I think we had one student in here. If you were a representative of Nike and you were displaying the newest tennis shoes of the year, we could fill the Oakland Coliseum.
Maybe, there might be more people.
I would love to see a critical media literacy class at Ashland High School, like the real version.
And I would very much like to help provide any curriculum for free to anyone who wants to do it. And you could even work with Ben Boynton, who's on our board and works with Acme, that specializes in K-12 critical media literacy education.
Yeah, maybe I can find somebody that can be that.
Mickey, M-I-C-K-E-Y, like the mouse, at projectcensored.org. Yep, anybody that wants to contact me and wants things, I'm happy to help.
The other point I wanted to make, you're talking about the people that pull the strings or outside of the picture frame. I don't know if anybody's read the book King of California about the wealthiest farmer possibly in the world. I think this was probably in the 20s or 30s. No one ever heard his name. He lived in Los Angeles. He would fly to the San Joaquin Valley. He successfully drained the largest lake west of the Rockies, Tulare Lake, so that it could be, used for ranching and cattle. He got the government to dam the Kern River and other rivers. He got the government to do his evil doings, and he just managed his empire of farming, and no one ever heard of him.
Well, the Kochs, the Mercers, the Sacklers, the Mellon Scaife. I mean, look, until very recently, a lot of people didn't know the Koch brothers. You know, I mean, in the United States of Distraction book out this summer, we go through and I list at least a dozen of those groups going back to the 70s, right? I mean, and this has been going on for a long time, and a lot of the money that they're paying out is to create front groups so that they can hide behind them. I mentioned the Heartland Institute, for example, in passing earlier, which was totally funded by ExxonMobil, right? I mean, you wouldn't know that by going to the Heartland Institute. Nobody in the corporate media ever said, here's so-and-so from the Heartland Institute, totally funded by ExxonMobil, and they pay $10,000 per article to cast doubt on global warming and climate science. That'd be one heck of an intro, right? You know, if you were an actual journalist, you'd probably say that, right? You'd at least try to say, like, this person has an agenda. Totally fine. What they say after that might be factual, might be very important to hear, but it's important, too, that you're informing the audience who might be less likely to be aware of who these players are. Now, look, the audience should be asking the right questions, and they should be digging into it and figuring it out. That we can't outsource our agency. That's part of the problem here. If you don't think for yourself, somebody else is gladly going to do it for you, right? Which is why I teach critical thinking courses. Emma Goldman, the great anarchist feminist, once said, the most unpardonable sin in society is independence of thought. And I think we need a lot more sinners. But in order to get them, you got to have them be thinking critically. And then they start to think independently, right? It's a process, but it's something that can be taught. And it has to be taught all the way up. It can't just be like, bam, you're smashed into college, you're 20, and then somehow you got in Huff's class. Man, you're doomed, right? And they're just like, how did I end up in this class? And you know, half of them are just like, you're full of it. I never heard any of this. This wasn't on the test. I didn't learn this in school. This wasn't in the paper. This wasn't on my Twitter feed. You got to get around all that. So not only then do I get to teach critical media literacy, but I've actually got to work on some kind of deprogramming regimen. You know, I mean, I've actually got to get people down to where they're almost near a neutral territory blank slate so that I can then begin building blocks up again. You got to like tear down all this, the confirmation bias beliefs that have been accruing over the years. So by the time they come to me, or come to any of us in college, and look, let's remember that not everybody goes to college. And I teach at a big community college, Diablo Valley College outside of Berkeley with 22,000 students, right? And I teach U.S. history too. And I tell them those stories that you were telling. And you know what's interesting? Is that after the students are in my class for a few weeks, all of a sudden they're like, you might be a little crazy, but this is not boring. You know, and I tell them, I'm like, you go look it up. You prove me wrong, and you get 5 more points. You know, because I love to be proven wrong, because that means I'm learning now. You know, it's like, school me. You know, and I ask for it. But unfortunately, I am right some of the time about a lot of this stuff. But it's not about being right. It's about just trying to get the information across and get people thinking critically. And I'm with you. I wish that there were students here. The only way you can do that, however, is if you get to the professors or the student clubs and you have them fill the place. You know, for example, I gave a talk last week at another campus, middle of the day. This place was full, and there were people in the halls. Because, yeah, I mean, it's not like that students don't care. I bet you anything most of the students and faculty on this campus had no idea this was happening. I bet almost anything. That's also part of the problem, is that there are too few people doing this work, and it's very difficult for a few people to do everything. Invite the people, get the money, put it on. I mean, here we were running around like nuts making you wait because we had to figure out the tech. I mean, there was no people here really doing all that work. There were a couple of people. And we had to scramble and figure it out and get in that room and go over here and hook this up and do, you know, I mean, like you said, if I was the CEO of Nike, they would have ridden me in on a golden chariot, you know, or one of those shoes, you know, with the wings on it, right? Made by a 12-year-old in Vietnam for 20 cents an hour, right? I'm sure that wouldn't come up in the talk, right? But again, it's not because young people don't care. It's because often they don't know. And that's part of being young, is not knowing. It's apparently a part of all stages of life. But in particular, if you give these people a chance, they come. They want to be part of it. And so again, I would say, let's try this again. Right? Happy to come back here next year or in the fall when I have 2 books out and a movie and do a showing. And I'll reach out to faculty here. I'll reach out to people here. I'll pull out all the strings. And everybody that's here now, you commit to bringing one more person. and you commit to bringing one teacher and one student that you know in your life. And suddenly, you know what will happen? This room will be full.
Bigger room.
Yeah, it'd be great, but I'd be happy with this one. Yeah.
Relevant to students caring, I really appreciated your mentioning RVML. He's one of the few writers that I've come to deeply trust. He's a Sam too. But he's been talking about lately is a guy named Jim Bendel, who's a, you know, he's a university professor from England, who put out an academic paper on basically near-term extinction. And it was completely rejected by the experts because it was too scary.
I'm sure it was.
He issued it publicly, and it just went viral, and he became like almost instantly famous. And it's catalyzed something that's called the Extinction Rebellion, which is the young people,
Yes.
millennials, that are shutting down fucking bridges
Yep.
and roads all over Europe. Now, I haven't seen one thing in the mass media about any of that. And
Very little.
My question's a little bit deeper. What's your take on how stuff like near-term extinction? I'm using that as kind of a capsulization of that kind of stuff. Is that being censored in the large media also? That's my question.
Like the sixth mass extinction?
No. It's stuff like Guy McPherson's been putting out.
Yeah.
Okay, and Jem, who's an academic also, has been putting out that same kind of data. And he's getting this kind of this underground swell of young people just stepping forward.
Yeah. Yeah, well, again, I think you hit the nail on the head. The same forces that tend to control, and I know academics, they don't like to admit this, because academics have to be dripping with integrity, and no, not my journal, no, not my board of editors. I could tell you lots of stories of journals that have plenty of corruption behind the scenes, and cronyism and a whole bunch of other stuff that goes involved. In fact, one of the stories we did several years ago was actually written by one of the lead editors at The Lancet, one of the leading medical journals out of Britain. And so this person actually wrote a study of the journals and concluded that conservatively, half of what they were reporting in the journals was false, fraudulent, or tainted by conflicts of interest. I mean, these are like trend-setting journals that the rest of them model or mimic or republish or follow. And this guy is, again, canary in the coal mine, blowing the whistle, saying, look, man, we're all just blowing smoke. And this is, again, why a lot of these journals then aren't going to publish those reports. Where are they going to go with it? I mean, in the United States, yellow vests are just like, I don't know, a construction crew, people, I mean, again, they don't want to call attention to mass mobilized social movements because people might get ideas. Like, I'm not just going to watch. I'm going to do it. And look, people that are living in the coastal areas, people that are living this, again, it's even the Pentagon and the Rand Corporation admitted this years ago. They're like, climate crisis is the main threat of the 21st century. Not terrorism, not jihadis, not radical Wahhabism, none of it. The problem is going to be with climate issues, and that's why we got to shut it down and control it. And so the more and more you get people trying to break through those cracks, look, they don't know what to do with it. Number one, the advertisers, big oil, big tech, they're not going to have it. Big tech is busy raping the earth in Africa and the Rift Valley, killing 10 million people so that you can have coltan in our phones. And so that the military-industrial surveillance complex can go to war every day. They can't go to war without it. That's what's driving all this madness, right? It's capitalism and control, greed. I mean, it almost seems biblical in its base simplicity. But unless we break through that, and I think the young people are the ones that are going to be getting our attention because they're loud and there's something obnoxious about adolescence that's important, right? It's important. But I'm telling you that I think it's totally by design that these stories are not going to be getting picked up. They're fine for the fodder of Hollywood scary movies. But look, these people can't admit that we are ill-equipped to handle the situation as it currently exists, and that will incite mass panic. They already know it's inciting mass panic. That's why the RAND Corporation has published these studies for the Pentagon that are talking about migration. Where's the next threat? Where's the next border problem? You know why? Because we're driving it and they're coming where it may be safer. And you may say, like, well, the United States isn't exactly a safe place, whether it's for reporters or people or whatever. Yeah, but where do you think people that are being colonized in Africa are going? They're going to Europe. Where are people going from Yemen? They're going to England. They're going to France. And now all of a sudden in Europe, they're like, we've got an immigration crisis. If you stop invading other countries and blowing up their people, maybe they'd stay there. And if you'd share the wisdom of culture with them and listen to theirs, we might be able to build some seriously radical, awesome civilization. We can. But these, where is it? These people, they're right here. Peter names them all. They're the ones that are doing it. And they need to hear from us. They need to hear from that young woman. I'm forgetting her name, sadly. Yes, Greta, I'm sorry. Just amazing what one person can do, right? And I know all of us think that. We're all like, man, one person, what can I do? It's the end of the day. I got to grade papers. I got to do this. I've got a wife and kids. This is why I do all this. I couldn't do any of this stuff if it weren't for my wife. And I'm doing it for my kids, but I'm not just doing it for my kids. I'm doing it so that the people that are kids now that are older than them are going to help them. They're going to bring them up into the fold. And I'm trying my best, as frustrating as it is, to teach them to be little critical thinkers, little lawyers, right, and little stewards of the earth, so that they come up and they give me crap. They call me out on my business and my hypocrisy, because we're all hypocrites. They call me out on it, and it helps. I mean, you may not want to hear it at the time. You're just like, it's like, it would be just easier if you would listen to me. I'm right, you're wrong. Wait a minute, I'm starting to sound like Fox News. I'm starting to talk to my kid like that. Right? You can't do that. You can't do it. And so you got to practice what you teach, because it's not preaching. It's really about teaching and learning and sharing. And I come back to that all the time. And I learned that from, really learned that lesson from my dad, who died of asbestos cancer 15 years ago by a bunch of lying criminal corporations that wanted to profit off his life. And rather than the asbestos, just like Exxon, 40 years ago, they knew they were killing the planet, and they hid the studies. Asbestos did the same thing in the 40s and 50s. MetLife, they sat on all the studies because they figured an accounting problem. They'd be like, well, once people figure this out, we'll have enough money in the bank to pay them off. And we only have to pay the people off to figure us out and take us to court and win. So they already know that the accounting problem has been solved. The dead people thing, not so much. But they're not interested in that. And we got to stop kidding ourselves. They're not interested in that. They're not really interested in us. And I say this all the time, and I don't like us-them binaries as a rule, but if they're not interested in us, why are we so interested in them? Meaning, why do we buy their stuff? Why do we watch their shows? Why do we patronize them? Why? Right? This is a good question for us all to consider, where we can start maybe changing some of our habits. Yes, sir. Paul?
Thank you, Mickey.
Great author, by the way, and I thank you for the gift of the book you gave me. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I also have a film premiering in Hollywood this weekend, and film on Vimeo.
Oh, right on.
That people can tune into. In my work, I've been a whistleblower the past 28 years. I was the director for Sea Shepherd in Hawaii when I learned about the alternative basis for the global economy. And I think the answer to your question is that people are
I think the answer you probably know, there would likely be tectonic shifts, paradigmatically shifting developments, which is what we need. Or we, yeah, not to be cynical and paraphrase George Carlin, but George Carlin said that environmentalism is about us. It's about our species and what we're doing to it. Once we make the earth uninhabitable for us and other living things, the earth will purge us like the virus we are. And it will carry on without us as the sun burns on. And I always, that always struck me when he said that, because I grew up watching him and always found him to be very interesting. And I was far more sarcastic, bitter, and cynical when I was younger somehow. I got it out of the way. Yeah.
Give you a ray of hope.
Yeah.
For what you're doing, because I've been doing it for a long
Yeah.
time too, and my son, I'll be 64 this year, and I have a 12-year-old son, so I can't afford to be pessimistic.
No, you can't.
My son pointed out to me, his favorite quote of mine is that one person can make a difference, but one person can't make a difference by themselves.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's where we all have to agree on a common set of values that is Gaia therapeutic rather than continuing the Gaia-sidal economy that leads to the other symptoms that you're referring to, the bias in journalism, the skewed, the study of values is known as axiology. And so our axiological orientation to the earth has to change before any of the other symptoms of imbalance can be pulled back into line. And that's what the young people are demanding now, is that we respect nature, essentially. And it's not enough just to generate clean energy. We have to heal the systems that we wounded. And there are ways to do that. But we're swimming against a tide
Yeah.
of irrational social prejudice against the solutions. That's built into the system that we're in the middle of right now.
Which is why the two-pronged approach that we took in United States of Distraction is not to reform education and the free press, but is to actually simply recreate them with these values, with these principles, and actually follow through and create and pursue them, and then reinforce them by supporting each other. And in the process, that means turning off CNN. That means turning off cable news. That means not just, we read it, we look at it, we study it, but that shouldn't be the primary place you're looking for information. People should be waking up. In fact, some are. Even Neiman and Poynter and some of the more elite foundations and institutions of higher education in this country that pump out the warmongers and the heads of state that carry on this old paradigm, right? But they too are saying, they're realizing that one of our biggest challenges in education is that not just getting back to the Dewey-like basics of critical thinking in education pro forma with critical pedagogy, but also getting back to local grassroots journalism, because that's one of the things that died with the Telecom Act of 1996. That's what media scholars from Bob McChesney and Victor Pickard and others across the spectrum have been crowing about for years. And there are now initiatives in small form, but there are now initiatives to rebuild local journalism. And it's a major effort right now in New Jersey. There's a big effort with Free Press. It's only $5 million, but they were able to cobble money together from the state from 2 failed stations, and they used the FCC licensing to get money, right, to use it and then sink it back in and recreate grassroots level journalism, right? It took 20 years to demolish our local journalism in this country, and it took another 20 to 30 working on it behind the scenes before that. So it's going to take another 20 to build it back up, and we don't have that long. That's why that's probably why when the students come into my class, they're like, this guy's crazy. I don't know how much time I have. I don't know how much time any of us have. but we can't waste it. You know, and I think that that's what I just am ever grateful for. I was talking about my dad earlier, and one of the biggest values that I learned from him was he told me earlier in life, he said there's two kind of people in the world. It's one of those essentialist lessons, right? And you're just like, whoa, better take notes. Two. And he said, there's givers and there's takers. And he said, you're a giver. We're all takers, but what do we come back to, right? And when we take, do we give back? And do we give back more than we take? Do we take more than we need? It turned out to be like this big rabbit hole of a lesson, right, that I'm still playing with. But I'm ever grateful that I had, my parents were working class. I grew up out in western Pennsylvania, and they did their best, warts and all. So here I am, trying to do what's right. Are there any women in the audience that want to say something? Only saying this because I see that are men talking. Anybody else want to have a say? I know we have to wrap up here, so yes.
Last question.
Yes.
We have a tremendous resource here in the Grove Valley in KSKQ.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to KSKQ. Yes, yes, yes.
Part of our responsibility is community radio. What can we do better to get the message out?
Try to tell more people in Ashland that you're here. Again, and take this extraordinarily constructively. Jason, of all people, who is like me. I don't know how many hats you all have. Wes, I don't know how many hats you wear in the course of a day, right? But, I didn't see any posters for the event in town. That's one. I asked people at a bunch of stores in town, because I was talking about the radio show. I was talking about the station. So I went into a whole bunch of shops, hanging around with a whole bunch of people, and I told a bunch of people, I said, for a town like Ashland, I'm like, you've got a gem of a resource in this radio station that a handful of people fought for and fight about, and it's so hard to do this work because it's generally thankless. I'm like, and it's on the FM dial, and they're just like, what's it called? Yeah, true, maybe. But it's also online. So maybe change the language. They'll understand. But outreach, man, don't be shy about what you're doing, because what you're doing is so important. And so many towns around this country don't have that. Never had it or don't have it anymore. And that's part of the dearth in local journalism. This town is vibrant and alive and intellectual. And yes, it brings tourists and it brings other people, but there's also people that live here the rest of the year. This is your community. This is your town. This is your university that costs way too much money to go to, right? So, you'd be surprised that the community radio station is a hub for everything else, Nick Johnson. No matter what your first interest is, if your second isn't media, you're going to be spinning your wheels. That's why everybody in this town should be interested in what's happening at this radio station. And as you said in the beginning, if you think there's something missing, as Jason said, if you think there's something missing from that station, that voice might be yours. That's the core of press freedom right there. And thank you for reminding us, because that's important. And I was interestingly enough, I was on Wes Brain's show with Jason the other day. I was on KBOO this morning, right? And because why? Well, because they're doing a 3-day fund drive because they need $40,000. It's the same reason the school has to do a bake sale so that the kids can hire a music teacher or a play person, right? And again, back to the bumper sticker we have to go. It'll be a fine day in the world when, the schools and the community media and everybody else gets what they need, and the Air Force has to have a bake sale for their F-35 plane that doesn't fly. Right? But that's back to our values, right? And they got to flip around. And I think I say this with all earnestness, not because I'm here and because I'm here with the radio station, KSKQ. It's not just because of this. I'm on KPFA, and we're on a bunch of other stations. That is such a huge builder of community through communication, whether it's on FM or online or whatever. When people start to realize that they have a stake in an investment in something and it's not money, It's values. It's something else that's worth something. Then all of a sudden they are interested and they want to be part of it, right? Some of the things that we never hear in corporate media, labor, right? And Wes, you've been doing that probably your whole life. Labor activism, working class rights. Well, again, why do you think working people don't have unions anymore like they used to? It's been drummed out of them by the corporate press that says there's no problem here. If there's a problem, it's you. You're just not good enough to get the big money jobs. That's the same propaganda that Carnegie was feeding people in the 19th century and Horatio Alger myths. Those need to be dead and buried long ago, but they're still with us. And I think community media is really an antidote to that, because it goes and it tells the stories and gives a platform for people that already have a voice that you'll never hear in the corporate press. In this town, as you were saying, had a couple papers, now down to one, owned by the same group. That's the same story in almost every town in this country, right? So again, don't be shy to promote yourself, and I surely won't be shy promoting you. And if there's anything I can do to help your station and anything going on in your community, let me know. Because I will do it. And I only live 5.5-hour drive down the street. And we have to wrap up, actually, because I want to be mindful of people's time. We're past 9 o'clock. I'm happy to be out there and talk to you, and we have books for sale. Would love to talk to more of you. Again, extra special thanks to everybody at KSKQ, and certainly Jason Houck. Thank you for everything you did to try to bring me here. I appreciate it. And thanks to all of you. A big round of applause for you coming and for being part of it. So it's an honor to be here with all of you. I'll talk to you out there. And if you're around tomorrow at 6 o'clock, meet and greet, circle, maybe just have like a really informal kind of talk over at the Metaphysical Library, which is another great resource that exists in this town. And Jason told me a fabulous story about how he originally found out about Project Censored at the Metaphysical Library. Yeah.
I first saw the book.
Yeah. So hopefully I'll see you here in a minute and maybe tomorrow too. Thanks, everybody.